Story 1. This incident took place around 12 to 14 years ago when I was approximately 3 to 5 years old. While much of the story is now missing or fuzzy due to the passage of time, I vividly remember the worst parts. I did not learn about the full extent of what my mother did until more than 8 years later. To provide a bit of background, I have a disability called myelomeningocele spina bifida, which is the most severe form of spina bifida. It leaves a large scar on your back that is very sensitive. Most people with this condition are paralyzed from the scar downward and have weak muscles, but I am fortunate enough to be able to walk, even though I have very little calf muscle. However, that doesn't play a major role in this story. Now, let's talk about the babysitter, who I will call abusive babysitter. I don't remember many details about her, but she was overweight and had either blonde or orange hair. She was divorced and had 2 or 3 daughters, who I became friends with. That's all you need to know for now. Let's move on to the story. At the time, I had to go to a babysitter every weekday because both of my parents worked full-time. Abusive babysitter ran a babysitting service from her house, which was just a few blocks away from where I lived. For the first few months, everything seemed fine, or at least that's how I remember it. But things started to get worse over time. She would punish me for the smallest things and spank me daily. The spankings were so hard that by the end of the day, I would still have a bright red handprint on my body. One day, after I ate a piece of bread, she made me eat the crumbs off the plate so she wouldn't have to clean it. Nap time was another unpleasant experience. Abusive babysitter had me sleep in what she called a luxurious crib. But this crib was placed in a bathroom that was being renovated. It was surrounded by sharp equipment that I could have easily reached and hurt myself with. As all this continued, I began having huge panic attacks whenever my mom and I even headed in the direction of abusive babysitter's house. I would plead with her not to take me there, but my mom assumed that it was just normal separation anxiety or discomfort with being in an unfamiliar place. Eventually, my mom started noticing the handprints on me and became suspicious. She asked why I had these marks, and in the best way a 3 to 5-year-old could, I explained that abusive babysitter would hit me often. My mom was furious. She went straight to abusive babysitter's house and confronted her, yelling about how wrong it was to abuse someone else's child. After their argument, my mom contacted Child Protective Services and reported that abusive babysitter had been abusing a disabled child. Later, I learned that abusive babysitter lost her ability to babysit and that her daughters were taken away and supposedly moved to their father's place. Now that I'm older and fully understand the severity of child abuse, I don't feel any sympathy for what happened to abusive babysitter. She treated her own daughters the same way, and they resented her for it. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Story 2. It all started when my girlfriend rented a townhouse with her friends. The place was nice, but it came with this annoying homeowners association. You know, those groups that make up rules for everyone to follow. Now, parking was always a headache for my girlfriend and her roommates. But for me, it was a breeze. I just slap on the visitor's pass and park in the guest lot. No problem, right? Wrong. I used to stay over once or twice a week. One morning, I woke up and my car was gone. Poof, vanished into thin air. At first, I thought someone stole it. I mean, who'd want to steal a 10-year-old Honda with a manual transmission? But nope, turns out it was towed. I called up the homeowners association, thinking there must be some mistake. That's when they hit me with this ridiculous rule. Homeowners association. We have a rule that says a car can only be parked in a visitor's spot for a maximum of 72 hours. But I've never parked here for more than a day at a time. Homeowners association. Well, you see, the rule means 72 hours total, not consecutive. So if you park here once a week for 10 hours, by the 8th week, you're breaking the rules. That doesn't make any sense. The rule is to stop people from storing their cars here, right? Homeowners association, rules are rules. A board member saw your car and put it on the tow list for abusing the visitor's pass. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were twisting the rules to make it seem like I was doing something wrong. I asked them to give me back the $150 I had to pay for the towing, but they wouldn't budge. At their next meeting, I tried again to get my money back. Look, this is clearly a misunderstanding. Can't you see that I wasn't abusing the system? Homeowners Association, we've reviewed your request and we're denying it. The bylaws are clear. But that's not fair. I'm a visitor, using the visitor parking as intended. Homeowners Association, our decision is final. I left that meeting fuming. These people were being completely unreasonable. That's when I decided to take matters into my own hands. If they wanted to play by the rules, fine. I'd show them what rules really mean. I took them to small claims court. Yeah, you heard that right. Going up against this big, bad homeowners association over $150. But it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about principle. When the court date came, I was nervous but determined. I laid out my case, explaining how the homeowners association was twisting their own rules. Your Honor, the intent of the rule is clearly to prevent people from using the visitor lot as long-term storage. I've never parked there for more than a day at a time. Their interpretation goes against the spirit of their own bylaws. The homeowners association had even brought a lawyer. Can you believe it? All this fuss over a parking spot. But I stood my ground. Homeowners association lawyer, the bylaws clearly state a 72-hour limit. Mr. Smith has exceeded this limit over multiple visits. But that's not how any reasonable person would interpret this rule. It's meant to stop abuse, not punish actual visitors. I gotta tell you, waiting for the judge's decision was nerve-wracking. But then, Judge, I find in favor of the plaintiff. The Homeowners Association's interpretation of their bylaw is unreasonable and goes against the clear intent of the rule. They are ordered to repay the towing fee and court costs. I couldn't believe it. I won. Not only did I get my $150 back, but they had to pay for the court costs too. And the cherry on top, they wasted money on that fancy lawyer for nothing. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt like David who'd just taken down Goliath. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about standing up to people who abuse their power and twist rules to suit themselves. From that day on, every time I parked in that visitor's spot, I felt a little surge of victory. And you bet I made sure to never stay over 72 hours, consecutively, that is. Story 3. As some of you may know, I previously posted about my parents refusing to return my Nintendo Switch after one of my siblings took it. Many commenters advised me to call the police or Child Protective Services if my parents ever dropped my younger siblings off at my door without asking again. I waited, and for about 3 months, there was no contact between us since the last time my mom called, and I refused to babysit without being paid. But then, the inevitable happened. My parents suddenly called, asking me to babysit, acting like the whole situation with the Switch had never occurred. I told them I wouldn't babysit unless they paid me, and it had to be on a day I wasn't working. My schedule had changed, and I no longer had Saturdays off, something I had arranged with my boss, because Saturdays were the days they most often asked me to babysit. Plus, picking up an extra shift helped me financially. As usual, my dad got furious and told me I needed to man up and help out. I pointed out that I was already manning up for my own life, just like he claimed to do at my age. However, unlike him, I wasn't putting my responsibilities on others. He always worked Saturdays and placed a lot of his responsibilities on me. So, as far as I was concerned, he could take a step back. He started yelling, and my mom quickly took the phone away from him. I calmly told her I could only babysit on Sundays, as that was my only day off. I also insisted on being paid $30 and that they provide pre-packed lunches, dinners, and snacks for my siblings. I wasn't about to spend my own money feeding them, that wasn't my job. I also warned them that if anything was taken from me, like the Switch incident, I would call the police to get it back. I saved the receipt and documented the serial number, so I could easily prove it was mine. At that point, My mom lost her temper and started swearing up a storm. I let her rant without responding, and when she finally demanded I say something, I told her they had my conditions: Sundays only, $30, and pre-packaged food, or they could forget it. There was a pause on the line, and then my mom started yelling again, saying my younger siblings, who are 14 and 15, had to step up because I wasn't helping anymore, and they needed a break. I laughed and asked, "Oh, like the breaks you gave me?" Which was never. My mom tried to argue that it was different because I was the oldest, but I told her it wasn't different at all. They had parentified me, and I missed out on a lot of my childhood because of it. Now that I was living my own life, they were hypocrites for expecting me to step up again when they had two teenagers at home who could do everything I used to do. She switched to playing the victim, saying my teenage siblings were rebelling and not listening to them. I told her that wasn't my problem. They needed to figure out other childcare options because I was too busy living my life. My dad got back on the phone and started yelling at me again, but I just laughed and said he was full of hot air. He was talking, but not really saying anything. My mom took the phone back and pleaded with me one more time. I reiterated my conditions: Sundays only, $30, and pre-packaged food. I also reminded them that I wouldn't hesitate to call the police if they made any threats or took any of my belongings. As they started yelling at each other, I told them to figure it out and get back to me later, then hung up. For a while, there was silence again. But a few weeks later, on a Saturday morning, I was getting ready for work when I heard a loud, rapid knock at my door. It was the kind of knock my mom had always used, so I knew it was her. I also heard someone quickly running down the hallway afterward. Through the door, I could hear my two youngest siblings bickering and tapping on the door. My mom had dropped them off and ran. Thanks to the advice I received in my previous post, I had a simple plan in place. I opened my window, climbed out, and walked away. My apartment is on the ground floor at the end of the building, so it's easy for me to slip out the window by removing the screen. I called a neighbor, a sweet elderly lady who loves kids and has known about my situation for a while. She called the police to report that two children had been abandoned in the hallway after their mother knocked on the door and took off. The police came and picked up my siblings. Later, my parents called me, furious. I played dumb and asked what they were so mad about. My mom admitted she had dropped off my youngest siblings at my door and ran. I asked if she had left them there without anyone answering, reminding her that I worked on Saturdays. She got really quiet for a moment and then yelled. How was I supposed to know that? I calmly told her that this was all her fault. She had abandoned her kids at my door, hoping I would be home, despite me telling her multiple times that I worked on Saturdays. It seemed like she was trying to force me into skipping work to babysit. She started making excuses, but I told her that what she did was inexcusable and childish. She ended up crying, and I let her go on for a while before asking if she was finished. She quickly switched back to anger and yelled that the police were charging her with child abandonment. I told her that wasn't my fault since she left the kids in the hallway. If I had been home, I would have called the police as well. I had told them many times that I work Saturdays, so I wouldn't be trapped into babysitting again. The rest of the conversation was just her complaining, and it didn't go anywhere. My mom somehow managed to get off with just a fine after convincing the police that she honestly thought I was home and would babysit. I don't know how much the fine was, but my sibling told me she had to pay one, which should make her think twice about pulling that stunt again. My dad wasn't charged because he was at work, and he claimed he didn't know she was planning to leave the kids at my door. Apparently, he was upset with her for doing it, which I found both funny and ironic. Things really came to a head on Thanksgiving. My parents invited me over, and I was expecting a trap. Sure enough, at dinner, my dad sat down, lit a cigarette, and told me he was ending this farce. He said I needed to move back home, help with the mortgage and bills, and help parent my siblings because they had no time to themselves anymore. He also mentioned that the fine had hurt their finances. I simply said, no, and stuck to that no matter how much he tried to order me. Eventually, he got so angry that he attacked me. Now, my dad isn't a small guy, But luckily, I'd been hitting the gym and learning some amateur fighting techniques. I was also wearing steel-toed boots. When he charged at me, I kicked him hard in the groin, then punched him in the face, sending him to the floor. He landed with a loud thud, threw up from the pain, and clutched himself in agony. I told my parents that I had been recording the entire time, so I had proof that my dad attacked me first. My dad, still writhing on the floor, told me to get out and never come back. I happily obliged, but not before taking a turkey leg from the platter and heading home. Since then, only my siblings have reached out. They said I walked out like a boss, and now there are jokes in the house about my dad's poor attempt to fight me. I spent Christmas with a friend's family, and they've invited me back for other holidays as well. Story 4. Back in 2015, I had recently been let go from my previous job. Around the same time, my dad had been diagnosed with cancer, and due to my less than stellar performance in channel partner sales, my employer needed me to start working weekends. This was a deal breaker for me since my dad was sick, so we agreed to part ways. There were no hard feelings, but I found myself out of work. A month or two later, I was offered a great job with a large company, which came with a pay raise and a better title. Naturally, I accepted. However, this meant I had to move across the country. At the time, it seemed worth it, and my dad's cancer appeared to be in remission, so I felt okay with moving away. Before the move, I lived just 30 minutes from my parents. The new company I joined was a massive short-term lending firm with over 1,000 locations across the United States. They were leaders in payday loans and title loans. I didn't love the idea of working for this kind of company, but I rationalized it by thinking that people make poor financial decisions all the time, and no one was forcing them to take out these loans. I assumed they understood what they were getting into. Important note: my role at this new company was to establish partnerships that would drive referrals from people who didn't qualify for traditional bank loans. Within a few months, I had ramped up monthly revenue to over $1 million. Everyone seemed nice, and things appeared to be going well, except for one ex-military guy, who I'll call Sergeant Grump, who made snarky comments about everyone. He would clock watch and report anyone to Human Resources if they came in at 9:05 am instead of 9 am or left at 4:45 p.m. instead of 5 p.m. You get the idea. Part of my job was to audit third-party applications to verify loans and calculate referral commissions. As part of this, I had to review loan contracts and their terms and conditions. That's when I began seeing red flags everywhere. People on welfare or Social Security were taking loans against their car titles with repayment terms they could never meet. I saw elderly women taking out personal loans against their Social Security checks to help pay for their grandkids' school books. The situations were heartbreaking. With a background in business finance and law from college, I knew these people were in serious trouble the moment they signed those contracts. Many would eventually lose their only vehicle to repossession or be forced to sign over their Social Security checks to meet the loan payments. This was all legal, but the terms were designed to trap them. I started bringing these concerns to the executives and leaders, but although they acknowledged my concerns, nothing changed. It seemed like we all knew, deep down, that what the company was doing wasn't right, but it was our livelihood. Around this time, I felt an urge to document everything. I didn't know why, but my gut told me to collect evidence. So I did. I began gathering information on how people were being coerced into signing these contracts, many of them illiterate or completely unaware of the loan terms. I witnessed these unethical practices firsthand during store audits, where employees used high-pressure tactics to push loans on people. The company intentionally didn't explain that the 28% interest was monthly, not annual. Every month, if the loan wasn't paid off in full, the person had to sign a new loan contract with new interest, carryover balances, and additional fees, often several $100s per new loan. They took full advantage of desperate and financially illiterate people, knowing they would never be able to pay off the loan. In many cases, the company would repossess their cars or threaten to expose their debts to employers and garnish wages. I hated it. I hated the company and the leadership that allowed these practices, knowing full well that they were unethical, if not illegal. So I followed my instincts. I had a handheld scanner and would print out any violation of federal guidelines I came across, scanning and saving everything on an SD card at home. Fast forward a few months. My birthday was approaching, and I had planned to take a week off to celebrate with my family. By this point, my dad was very sick, and I knew it would likely be my last birthday with him. We made the most of it and created some of the best memories I've ever had. After my time off, I was reluctant to return to work, but I told my mom that I'd come back the moment she needed me. The next day, after I returned to work, I received a call from my mom. "Dad is in very bad shape," she said. I went to my boss, who was a kind and compassionate person, and explained the situation. Without hesitation, he told me to leave and take as much time as I needed. He was incredibly understanding, and I will always be grateful for that. For context, Sergeant Grump, the guy who loved making snide remarks, had been passed over for my boss's position. He resented my boss and wanted the job for himself, so from day one, he made life difficult for all of us. On my second day back home, my boss called to let me know he had been fired. Apparently, Sergeant Grump had gone to the CEO and Chief Operating Officer to complain about my boss's lax approach to managing his team. He claimed that letting me leave without formal approval was inappropriate, and, as a result, Sergeant Grump was now my boss. My former boss warned me that Sergeant Grump would likely fire me too when I returned, so he wanted to give me a heads up. I stayed through my dad's funeral and then flew back to face the inevitable. Within 10 minutes of my return, Sergeant Grump called me into his office, told me I had violated company policy by taking unapproved time off, and said we needed to meet with human resources. I explained the situation: my father's passing, the funeral, my grieving mother, but he coldly responded, "I'm sorry that happened, but company policy doesn't excuse it." The human resources representative felt terrible that I was being fired, but Sergeant Grump insisted that I be let go. Since I had only been with the company for a few months, I didn't qualify for unemployment, and Sergeant Grump made sure I wouldn't get any severance either. I found myself broke, 5 months into a 12-month lease, with no money and no job. To make matters worse, I had just lost my father. I ended up having to sell most of my belongings and move back home to live with my mom. Now comes the righteous revenge. I tried to keep things civil, but Sergeant Grump and the executive team played dirty. It was time for them to face the consequences. I remembered the database of incriminating practices I had collected, so I called my former boss to get his advice. He was more than willing to help, and together we formed a plan. Over the next several weeks, we compiled a massive file to submit to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau (CFPB) detailing the company's unfair and predatory lending practices. While we had been complicit in these practices, we had voiced our concerns and wanted to make things right. We felt it was the least we could do to correct the damage we had witnessed. I handed everything over to my former boss, and we submitted it to the CFPB under the condition of anonymity. We didn't expect much to come of it, but we felt better knowing we had done the right thing. Unknown to us, there were thousands of complaints against the company, and our evidence helped build a case. About 5 months later, in early 2016, my former boss called me to say the CFPB had contacted him, and something big was about to happen. A few more months passed without much news, but then in June 2016, while I was having coffee and applying for jobs at my mom's house, I saw the company's name on CNBC. They were being hit with huge fines, legal fees, and their operations were essentially paused until the case was resolved. In the end, the company was fined nearly $10 million, incurred over $20 million in legal fees, and lost about $50 million in revenue due to the government's investigation. And as for Sergeant Grump, a former coworker informed me that he had been fired and thrown under the bus for failing to report employee concerns to the executive team, even though they were well aware of everything. To this day, there are still pending class action lawsuits and regional government actions against the company. But on a personal note, Things worked out well for me. My mom was relieved to have me back home after losing my dad. They had been married for 35 years. I took the time to learn a new career, which now pays better and brings me much more happiness. Watching that company get its comeuppance felt incredibly satisfying, knowing that justice was served on behalf of all the people they had lied to, exploited, and mistreated. As my grandma always said, some things may float to the top, but in the end, they all get flushed. It felt great to watch that company finally get flushed. Story 5. My neighbor just rang my doorbell to tell me that his wife asked us to stop hammering. I was completely taken aback. I just stared at him and said, "Excuse me?" He then informed me that we wouldn't be able to make any sort of noise for the next few months because of their newborn baby. I couldn't help but laugh in his face and close the door. Now, his wife is yelling at my door, and he's messaging me, asking if I could please just do what his wife says. A little background. My spouse bought our house in 2011. Both of our homes are single-family detached houses, and each lot is about 1.5 lots wide, which means there is roughly 33 feet between our homes, compared to the 6 feet of space between most homes on our street. The neighbor's husband had already been living in his house when I moved in 8 years ago. Shortly after moving in, I saw my neighbor for the first time and realized it was someone I had known since I was 4 years old. We went to school together all the way through high school, and now we're both 40. 3 years ago, he met someone, and at that time, she had a 2-year-old daughter. She would stay at his house, and I often found the little girl wandering the streets unsupervised. They would send her outside with no toys, no fenced yard, and no supervision, expecting her to entertain herself. The child was, and still is, quite a handful. 2 years ago, the mother and her daughter officially moved in. I run a daycare, so my yard is full of toys and fun things for the kids. However, I also have 3 fenced-off areas, one for our pool during the summer, one for our dogs, and one for our hot tub. All these areas have separate fences and self-closing gates, and my external fence is 6 feet tall. When the pandemic hit in 2020 and schools went virtual, the little girl never actually attended her online classes. Instead, she would come to my door during the day, ringing the bell and asking me to let her play in my yard. I would explain that she couldn't be in the yard when I had daycare kids, and that my daughter would come out to play after dinner. Despite this, she once dragged patio furniture to my fence, climbed over, and entered my yard. I don't even know how long she was there, but when she decided she was done, she couldn't get out because the latch on my gate is at the very top to prevent the daycare kids from opening it. She started screaming, and I ran outside in a panic. I took her back home and explained what happened to her mother. Instead of being understanding, her mom scolded me for not just letting the little girl play in my yard. I told her that I could face a $100,000 fine if her daughter was caught on my property during daycare hours. Despite explaining this, her mom continued to be upset and even called me some unkind names. I tried to let it go, but the situation kept happening. Eventually, I started sending them invoices for daycare fees. When that didn't work, I told them I'd have to call the police if it happened again, which I did. The next time the girl climbed into my yard, her mom and grandpa were both sitting outside on the stairs, watching her. They didn't even try to help her when she started screaming because she couldn't get out. The police arrived and told the parents that if this continued, the mother could be charged with child endangerment. After that, I installed proximity sensors at the top of my fence that notify me if anyone tries to climb over. Thankfully, things got better as the girl got older. Last summer, we set up an above-ground pool. I had just ordered a new pump system and heater, and the pool was about half filled with water. I also had just finished planting flowers in my planters. I glanced at my security cameras and saw the little girl by the pool. I rushed outside. The main gate was open because the neighborhood kids were running from yard to yard, playing. She had taken it upon herself to grab buckets of soil from my planters and dump them into the pool, causing $400 worth of damage to my brand new $1,000 pump and heater system, which had been installed only hours earlier. I was furious and shouted at her to get out of my yard and to stay out unless I or my spouse was outside. Now, fast forward to the present. The neighbors just had a new baby last week, and apparently the noise from me hammering in my basement is disturbing them 33 feet away in their house. They expect me to stop working on my project until the fall. So, here I am, sitting outside on my bench, enjoying a glass of water, while my outdoor speakers play some metal music as I mow the lawn, which is much louder than the little bit of hammering I was doing. I'll finish the hammering later tonight, after dark. Story 6. A Master of Business Administration is often thought to signify expertise in business, but more often than not, those with such a degree are neither true masters of anything nor particularly business savvy. Unfortunately, MBAs tend to speak fluently in buzzwords, jargon, and acronyms, which can easily fool many human resources departments into believing they bring tremendous value. Their perceived value often far outweighs their actual contributions. Recently, the company I work for was acquired. Before the acquisition, it was a profitable company with a great culture. However, all of that changed when the new owners decided that our company was in need of structure, hierarchy, and order. They believed everything needed to be fixed. As part of their overhaul, they brought in a new CEO who fired all the old managers and hired an MBA holder to manage the department I work in. This new CEO was determined to turn things around and made sure we knew to obey and submit to their vision. The new manager, Bob, came from the acquiring firm and fit perfectly into their mold. Instead of taking the time to understand the people, the processes, or the context of our work, Bob launched into his role with an iron fist, ruling by fear. He would accuse us of inefficiencies, criticize our work, and micromanage us in areas where he had no real understanding. He would frequently question why we weren't staying later, assuming that more hours equaled more productivity. Bob loved to preach about MBA management techniques, leadership, standardization, and metrics, along with trendy topics like artificial intelligence, automation, anything that sounded impressive on paper. And I say preach because that's all he did. He didn't execute or lead. He just talked and managed, failing to truly understand the work we were doing or how to make it better. As a result, we all became yes men, simply going along with whatever Bob wanted. His endless stream of corporate buzzwords and phrases left us speechless most of the time. The highlight of every meeting was Bob talking right up until the very last second of our allotted time. On the rare occasion that a meeting ended early, he would say, "I'm giving you some time back," implying that he somehow owned our time while we were at work. Wanting to be the center of everything, Bob asked us to involve him in everything. He wanted updates, input, and approvals on all matters, big or small. Naturally, we complied. From that day forward, everyone in our department began asking for Bob's input in writing for nearly everything. We requested his thoughts on even the simplest approvals and asked for his input on complex processes that he clearly didn't understand. Even when there was no action required from him, we made sure to copy him on all communications, even with vendors, for mundane matters like updating credit application details. Since Bob loved meetings so much, we started inviting him to every possible meeting, allowing him to talk at length about trivial matters that had no real consequences. We knew he loved hearing himself speak, so we encouraged it. There was something strangely satisfying about manipulating a manager into drowning us in pointless paper trails, processes, and meetings. Not only did it ensure Bob was fully involved in our day-to-day activities so he could be held responsible if anything went wrong, but it also made him feel important. And for us, it meant we spent our time doing a lot of nothing, with Bob none the wiser. Story 7. This story takes place about a decade ago, but it's still relevant to today. At the time, I was working as a technical writer for the government and was in the process of updating our old employee handbook. The original handbook was an outdated document from the 1940s, full of government bureaucracy. My task was to modernize it into a much more practical document, a concise page that included our policies and links to useful websites. such as the Office of Personnel Management and forms for workers' compensation. On the Monday of Thanksgiving week, my boss requested that the entire handbook be printed out and placed on her desk by the next morning. I spent about an hour printing the 200 or so pages and simply included the links to the various websites in bold. I left the printed pages on her desk and went home that evening, expecting everything to be fine. The next day, Tuesday afternoon, she called me into her office and began berating me. According to her, I was being stupid for thinking people could access a website from printed paper. She demanded that I print out all the content from the websites I had linked in the handbook. I calmly explained that these websites were vast and printing everything would amount to about 10,000 pages. She didn't care. She insisted it all needed to be on her desk first thing Monday morning. Now, mind you, this was already Tuesday, and we usually had part of Wednesday off. I had also applied for leave and was looking forward to a relaxing long weekend. Even though I don't have a family, I had personal plans, but I agreed to her request. I even got her written approval to print everything pertaining to the employee handbook from the online sources. However, I also had real work with real deadlines. For context, while she was my boss and handled my performance appraisals, which meant she had the power to make my life difficult or even fire me, my primary clients were teams responsible for engineering plans, biological assessments, scientific journal articles, and reports to Congress. These projects had strict deadlines, and if we missed them, it could cost the agency $100,000 a day in delay fees, or worse, upset a member of Congress. Never a good idea. I was growing tired of my boss's demands, which took time away from my actual work. So, Tuesday afternoon and all day Wednesday, I started printing. I had to visit each website, click on the links, and print each page. It was a tedious process. Then, on Wednesday, we received a critical congressional letter that required an immediate response. Had it not been for this letter, I might not have followed through with my plan. But with overtime approved to handle the congressional request, I got to work on both the letter and my boss's unreasonable printing task. I worked through Thanksgiving, alternating between completing the congressional response and continuing to print. By the time I finished, I had used every sheet of paper in our 14-story building. I had paper stored in about 20 different conference rooms and was running 5 printers at once for 4 days straight. The congressional response could have been done in 8 hours, but since it wasn't due until Monday, I stretched out the work, printing endlessly. By the end of the weekend, I had worked a total of 32 hours from Thursday through Sunday. I had underestimated the number of pages. Instead of the 10,000 pages I had initially thought, I ended up printing closer to 30,000 pages. On Monday, I placed the result of all my efforts, 2 massive stacks of paper, each about 6 feet high, inside my boss's office. Her office, which was already quite cluttered, now had piles of paper filling every available space. As expected, this didn't go over well. I was written up and had to attend a disciplinary hearing. The official charge? Malicious compliance. I managed to keep my job only because I had her request documented in an email.